Y es un gusto para mí presentar a Hilary, que estudió Ciencias Sociales en la Universidad de Manchester, cursó estudios bíblicos en el King's College de Londres y se doctoró en Teología en la Universidad de Cambridge. Actualmente se desempeña como directora de los programas del Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, que coorganiza, como ya saben, supongo, este seminario, y es profesora asociada en la Universidad de Cambridge, en la Faculty of Divinity. Y además quisiera agradecerte todo el trabajo que has hecho junto con Claudia estos últimos meses. Yo me acabo de enterar, en realidad ayer a la mañana, me dijeron que tenía que presentar. No he colaborado demasiado, lo han hecho ustedes dos prácticamente todo. I'll say that in English. Okay. So thank you very much for all the work you've put together with Claudia. And I was saying that I was just as an observer mostly. And they told me yesterday I had to make the presentations. Well, welcome again, and we are all ears.
Well, thank you very much, Juan Francisco. Is that the one? Okay. And I must say that actually it's Claudia that did most of the work. I just emailed her from time to time, and you know, we had lovely email correspondence, but she did the work. So, okay, what does it mean to be human? Well, we've had one or two thoughts about that over the course of this last couple of days. And of course, Leonardo gave us some other questions to think about between humans and computers. I just want to go through some of this thinking from a theological perspective and a biblical perspective. We've heard a lot of science, but that's not my remit. And first of all, I want to think, why does it matter to answer this question? What does it mean to be human? Well, of course, we've already heard about the challenges of scientific reductionism, the idea that we are nothing more than the sum of our genes or our atoms, depending on which scientific field you're working in. So we've heard about Richard Dawkins. Here he says, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment. And then I think this one is one that Dennis also quoted in his paper earlier this morning from Francis Crick. Everything about us, our joys, our sorrows, our memories, our ambitions, our sense of identity and free will, are in fact, says Crick, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And the trend in neuroscience to reduce conscious thought and decision-making to brain impulses, to neural connections, is very prevalent in the literature. I read, just in parenthesis, an interesting article, reference to an article just quite recently, where some cognitive psychology research had been done that suggests that actually perhaps human decision-making is not quite as rational as we might think it is, we might like to think it is. In fact, this research suggests that when actually people do make decisions, they do it either irrationally or irrationally, in other words, subconsciously. And the fact that we actually think and process before making decisions is perhaps a little bit of a myth, a post-Enlightenment myth. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger has published at least one, probably more, books that take this right to the ultimate in saying that philosophically we are in for a big shock. We're going to find that actually there is nothing except humanist materialism. Everything that we do is illusory, that we are doing it from any sense of volition, any sense of ourself, any sense of identity. We are all just machines. And he suggests there'll be a new image of mankind, image of man emerging throughout the next few years. I've got a series of questions that arise that we're going to look at in answering this question. They're questions that sort of spin off from it. And the first is, what distinguishes us from other animals? And there are numerous attempts by cognitive psychologists to try and get to the heart of what it is that distinguishes us from other animals. I've picked one by Warren Brown, who's a cognitive psychologist in America, and he suggests a series of things that altogether distinguish us from other animals. Language, the ability to communicate infinite number of propositions, complex abstract ideas relating to the future and the past as well as in the present. And there's a sense that some animals obviously can communicate with their kin in the present, but the idea of being able to project to the future or have long memories and talk about the past, he suggests, is unique to humans. The theory of mind, the idea that you can consider the thoughts of another person. I don't just know what I'm thinking, but I can imagine or think about what Marcelo might be thinking or what Leonardo might be thinking. I may be wrong, but at least I can project into the fact that they have thoughts that other people are thinking and can understand and consider that. Episodic memory, this is the ability to remember specific things and specific events or people or places, and the fact that we have in our memory store a vast number of memories of events and places. Some of you, I could ask you to remember your primary school, where you've spent your young years at school, and an image will come to your mind. Or people, somebody that's been around and no longer here. So that is a memory of specific events. We have the conscious mental control of our behavior. We have the ability to decide, as Dennis said, we think, at least, we have the ability to decide whether we act or not, both in physical terms and in emotional terms. We choose whether to react to situations and to stimuli. We have a very large future orientation. We run mental scenarios. We consider the implications of behaviors and events, and we're often projecting into the future what's going to happen. What's going to happen tomorrow? You know, what will take place? What decisions will I have to make? And on into the future. What will I be doing when I finish my degree? Where will I do my postdoctoral study? What jobs will I apply for? We're always processing the future. And it's not just the immediate future, which an animal might do to think about food, the next meal, or the next mate. It's a long-term scenario. And we use emotional modulation. In other words, the ability to change our emotions in response to other people's emotions. And we use those to guide our ongoing behavior and decision-making. So if we walk up to a friend and we see that they are in tears, our emotional modulation will tell us that it's not appropriate to laugh and crack a joke with them, but that actually we may want to put a hand on their shoulder and just change our behavior. Even if we're very happy, change our behavior to fit their circumstances. So Warren Brown, and this is quite standard lists, and if I can get this to work, this is from his book, What Happened to the Soul. Another way of considering what it means to be human, and this is one that's been around in philosophy for several centuries, is to do with the moral considerability of the person. And this is something that we can perhaps attribute back to Kant as perhaps a very well-known advocate of this position. He said, every rational being exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will. Beings whose existence depends not on our will but on nature, in other words, non-human animals, nevertheless, if they are not rational beings, in other words, not human, have only a relative value as means and are therefore called things. On the other hand, rational beings are called persons, inasmuch as their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves. So here we have the thought taken from coming from Greek philosophy and encapsulated in Kant, that rationality is what counts. And that's why I find it quite interesting, this recent research I quoted earlier, that we're not actually quite as rational in our decision-making as we might think. But rationality has been a criteria, and along with that, moral considerability. The fact that the human being can have the representation I raises him infinitely above all other beings on earth. By this, he is a person, a being altogether different in rank and dignity from other things, such as irrational animals, with which one may deal and dispose at one's discretion. It would be true to say that in the 18th century, animal rights and the way you should treat animals in research and so on was not high up the agenda. His view is very functional of the way human beings should interact with their environments. And that is something that we would probably want to question today. But the fact that we are an I, for Kant, gives us moral considerability. People have moral considerability. Now, some of the problems with this definition, and even Warren Brown's list, which in many ways echoes with us, is that they don't apply to specific cases we can think of. So a lot of Warren's list doesn't apply to children, very young children, infants. And it wouldn't perhaps apply to those with serious neurological disease, people with Alzheimer's disease or other mental incapacity. And so they become at best a sort of general, in general terms, description of people, and not specific to individuals and to individual cases. And I want to give you an extreme example of moral considerability that feeds into that problem. And that's the example of Peter Singer. And he distinguishes between the human and the person. He says, there could be a person who is not a member of our species, and there could also be members of our species who are not persons. Now, Singer actually thought that some higher apes were persons because of their capacity to perform some certain things that to conceive of themselves as distinct entities. And he thought that some humans were not persons. His definition of a person is, he says, the only beings who have a right to life are those who conceive of themselves as distinct entities existing over time. So these are persons. And for Singer, a newborn baby does not fit into this category. A newborn baby does not conceive of itself as a distinct entity existing over time. I think Singer said at least babies of under 1 month fall into this category. And so he would be amongst those whom Dennis was referring to with the article he put up that was post-birth abortion, but which he relabeled infanticide, that there is no right to life automatically for newborn babies. And so for Singer, a newborn baby is not a person, and therefore it is justified to terminate their life. For Singer, mentally disabled are also not persons. Chimpanzees, adult chimpanzees, have, for Singer, more moral considerability than either of these. So I find that this whole question is quite problematic when you just approach it from philosophical or ethical and psychological grounds. For me, it feels unsatisfactory because it's not an account that seems to take account of the whole spectrum of human life from birth, or we might even want to say before birth, through to death, however that might be, and however unable to communicate or have a sense of self somebody is when they die. So that's a question. The next question I want to look at is, do we have free will? And again, Dennis touched on that. And of course, the danger of blaming our genes or our neurons is that it removes any sense of moral responsibility and culpability. And Nancy Murphy says, if humans are purely physical organisms, how can it fail to be the case that all of their thoughts and behavior are determined by the laws of neurobiology? I won't say any more about that because Dennis covered it quite well in his talk. I will refer to, in a bit more detail, what he talked about, the Libet experiments. And these were experiments in the 1980s that were looking at the way that conscious, voluntary movements in the brain show up as neurological signals before the subject expresses the will to move. And his argument was that actually something goes on in the brain before we even know that we want to move our hand, say. The Faraday paper that I've put up there is freely downloadable from the website, and it's actually a critique of the Libet experiment by a cognitive psychologist and psychiatrist, Peter Clark. And he makes some very good arguments, which I'm not going to go into now, as to why this is built on fallacious grounds. And it's a case of the research shows something, and then the explanation takes it a lot further in trying to make something more conclusive out of it. So do we have free will? That's an important question. Do humans have a soul? Well, there is actually very little in the biblical record to support a dualistic view of reality. Certainly in the Old Testament, there was no sense of body and soul. People were whole people, a holistic view, you might say, of humanity. And actually, a lot of theologians reject a dualist view of reality, as well as scientists. So this is a quote from Joel Green. The phenomenological experiences that we label soul are neither reducible to brain activity, nor an evidence of a substantial ontological entity such as a soul, but rather represent essential aspects or capacities of the self. So Joel Green is neither a reductionist nor a dualist, and he's saying that actually the things that we label something our soul or our spirit, but it's actually not something that's separate. It's not something we have to find a place for in our brain or somewhere. It's something that is actually a whole person. The idea of the soul is very popular, certainly in Christian discourse, in Christian belief, in Christian practice, and to question it perhaps for some people is really difficult. But of course, we need to have an answer to the neurobiologists that say, actually, we are only biology. And so we need to think about how we're going to describe that bit of us which is not just reducible to neurological pathways, that sense that many of us have that there is an ultimate reality out there and that we can respond to that reality, and that we are not just deluding ourselves. So if we reject the dualist view as being one that is going to come up against science and always be sort of fighting a losing battle, but we don't want to accept Dawkins and Singer's physical reductionism, what else do we have? Well, something that is labeled, I don't know if it's good to have a label, two-aspect monism. And in a way, the quote that I just have up there from Joel Green is an expression of two-aspect monism. But this is a more clearer way that he puts it. Oh, is that the same quote? Did I just put the same quote up twice? Yeah, I did. Okay, sorry about that. This is from Peter Clark, who wrote the Faraday paper about the Libet experience. He said this: our subjective first-person account of our inner life and neuroscience's objective third-person account of our brain's activity refer to complementary aspects of a single unity. You have that idea of complementarity there that Dennis was talking to with regard to genetics and how our genes work. And here it's again being used to kind of try and talk about us and what makes us us. In fact, actually, Dennis yesterday talked of three narratives: the brain, the physical neural connections, the mind, the sense of self, this first personal subjective account that Peter Clark talks about. But then he talked about a third one, if you remember, our interactions with others, with other people, relationships. And we're going to come on to that in a little bit in a moment. Now, you might be thinking, if you're at all sort of theologically literate, if there's no such thing as the soul, what happens when we die? And that's obviously a big question, and it's a question that is one I can just only throw out one or two possibilities. You have to make your own mind up with them. I have a colleague in Cambridge who is an Anglican priest and a neuroscientist working in Addenbrooke's Hospital, and he and I have quite a few good debates about this, because he is a physicalist. In other words, he thinks that our bodies end when we die, but he's non-reductive. He doesn't think that in our lives we can be reduced to neurons and atoms, but he thinks that when we die, we do cease to exist, and that we're held actually in the memories of those that knew us and loved us. For me, that's a little bit too stark. Another idea is John Polkinghorne, whose name will be known to a few of you, who suggests that when we die, although our physical bodies cease to exist and our soul is not some little thing that flies up to heaven, but that actually we are held in the mind of God. And so although our bodies are no longer in existence, God holds us in his mind, all that we are and all that we were. Now, I ought to say that this talk about what happens when we die is not about the final resurrection. The New Testament, for example, in Christian New Testament, says an awful lot more about the final resurrection, far, far more than it does about what happens in this temporal world when we die. In fact, it doesn't really say anything at all. One or two hints about that. But what Polkinghorne would say is that we're held in the mind of God until the final resurrection, and then we are recreated with a new body, and a new body in its holistic sense. Okay, so those are some questions, and you don't have to agree with them. We can discuss them later. I want to think a little bit more about some biblical and theological reflection and what that might have to offer. We've talked a little bit already today about Genesis 1 and 2, and I suppose if you were to ask the theological question to a Christian, well, what does it mean to be human? They might well answer, well, we're made in the image of God. And that might be a standard answer. It might be the first thing that comes to some people's mind. What's really interesting to me is that the phrase image of God is incredibly rare in the Old Testament. It only crops up in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 5. And in the New Testament, there's perhaps, 3 or 4 references, not more. So it's a concept that has almost become a life of its own outside of the biblical tradition. And we're going to come back to that and look at some of the theological tradition, but I'd like to just unpack a little bit more about what the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, which is my area of expertise, says about being human. And I'd like to start with the idea of mystery and wonder. So there's a psalm in the book of Psalms which describes the psalmist's sense of wonder that he is even in existence. It says things like this: "You knit me together in my mother's womb. Before any of my days were formed, you knew of them," addressing God. So it's a kind of reflection, if you like, on the theological mystery of God's dealings with an individual human being. But it's also a reflection on the biological mystery of conception and birth. Now, of course, in the ancient world, there was a lot more mystery than there is around today. But actually, in our lecture this morning, although there was so much detail about the formation of embryos and what, how that's the role of DNA in that, there's still a huge amount that scientists don't know. There is still a huge amount of mystery out there. And I don't know if perhaps if you're like me, you're not a geneticist, and you don't know very much about the sort of reproductive genetics, but I was left with a sense of awe that this incredibly complex process actually worked, because there's this sense that it seems so complicated, there could be so much that went wrong with it. And so perhaps in a way also, the psalmist reminds us that we still need to have that sense of awe at some of the biological mysteries that we've heard of, and the things that Marcelo was telling us about the neuronal activity. It is incredible, the detail that there is in our brains just to do simple tasks. And the other thing that Psalm 139 does, and this is echoed in Psalm 8, is give a kind of sense of comparison between humanity and the rest of the universe. Psalm 8 says, "What are humans that you are mindful of them? When I consider the stars and the expanse of the heavens, what are human beings?" So that sense of mystery and wonder is something that biblically defines our sense of what it means to be human. The second thing to say is that actually the Bible is very clear that we are creatures. We are not gods. And that sense of creatureliness is something that is a theme over and over again. I've just put a couple of references here. In Psalm 148, it's a psalm of praise to God, and in that psalm, the whole of the created order is invited to praise God. Inanimate and animate, so rocks and trees, animals, wild animals, domestic animals, and also humanity as part of that. So that sense of being part of a created order, we might say a biological system, is present there in the psalm as a way of reminding humanity that we are not gods, we are creatures, and the things that our biology tells us today are being put forward even in the ancient world when they didn't have that sense of biology. In the book of Job, which is an extended discussion of the problem of why do bad things happen to good people, which is still the problem, philosophical problem and theological problem that faces us today. We're no nearer, I don't think, to solving it than Job was when he was struggling with the fact that he'd had a lot of disaster happen to him, and he was a righteous man. He was not a bad man, so he was wrestling with that. And in Job 38 to 41, we get that sense of Job in dialogue with God, and God reminding him that the world, the universe, is much bigger than he is. And God reminding him that the universe carries on without him. God reminding him that the universe was going before he appeared. God reminding him that the universe and that God's provision for the universe is something that is not merely to satisfy human needs and human requirements. So God, in this speech that God has with Job, he says, well, who sends rain on the land where no one lives? It's a kind of rhetorical question. In other words, it's God. God sends rain on the land where no one lives, waters the desert which is uninhabited. And the point that the writer is trying to make is actually, Job, you're so locked up in your own circumstance, but actually you are part of creation. You are part of this great world that God cares for and makes happen. And again in Job 38, and again in Psalm 104, we have the sense that God is the one that provides food for not just human beings, but all of his creation. And that is something that is part of our creatureliness. I did a study on life and death in the Old Testament quite recently, and I found all different kinds of metaphors that are used to describe life and then the end of life. A lot of them are organic metaphors to do with being like the grass that fades, here today and gone tomorrow. That incredible sense for, in the ancient world, when they didn't know how old the universe was, of that we are just a moment in time. I mean, we know now from cosmology that we are just a moment in time, but in the Bible there's this incredible sense that we are just here and then we're gone. And life is short, life is transient, life is just there. It's from the dust and returns to it, Genesis 2 says. But the other side of that, of course, is that life is God-breathed. So Dennis was talking about the story of Adam, and in Genesis 2, God forms the human and then breathes life into him. God forms the animals and breathes life into them. So the Hebrew word nephesh, which some translations do translate soul, and is very misleading from that point of view. So I don't know if that works in Spanish, actually. Do you have a separate word? I don't know. In English, we have the word soul, which implies something ethereal, but actually in the Hebrew Bible, it's just the breath of God giving life to humanity or to the animals. The Old Testament has a really robust view of death. So death is what happens at the end of life, biological death. It's necessary and it's inevitable. Decay is inevitable. So very, in one sense, materialist about what happens after at death. There are some wonderful expressions about a life well lived. So, for example, Abraham, the great prophet, when he dies, it said, Abraham died old and full of years. Now, I don't know if that translates well into Spanish, but in English it's a repetition, old and full of years. But the way that it's expressed just gives that sense that actually he'd fulfilled his lifespan. He'd accomplished what he was set to do. And it gives a very rounded sense of death that I think in this society we are very, certainly in England, we're very afraid to think about death. We do everything we can to protect ourselves from it. We do everything we can to try and stop it happening. And of course it's right to use all that medicine can to keep people alive, but sometimes we actually don't want to let go and don't want to let people go. The only thing I would say about death in the Old Testament is that premature death is a cause for concern. There's a wonderful story of a king of Israel called King Hezekiah who gets sick. He actually gets sick because he's done something, and he gets sick and he's young-ish. He's not ready to die. And he prays to God because he just feels, my life is being cut short. I don't want to die yet. And he records this conversation with God in two different places in the Bible, this kind of conversation with God. And in the end, God hears his prayer and he lives. He doesn't die. He lives on and then fulfills his right span. So there's a sense in the Old Testament that actually death before your time is something to be fought against and something to, be concerned about. And then another idea that I think is really important, I talked about us being creatures and not gods. I think over and over again in the Old Testament, there's a theme of encouraging humility and not hubris or pride. So, for example, in the ancient Israelites, before then, the ancient people of the worlds tried to build a tower up to Babel so that they could be up near there with the gods. And God came down and destroyed the tower and confused their language. And so I think there's an important principle here when we're thinking about issues to do with how we view ourselves and how we view other people, ethical issues, end-of-life care, and so on. This sense of needing humility and being aware of hubris is very important. I think that in all areas of science, because it's always pushing boundaries, there can be that sense that actually we can take the place of God. And theologically, that can become very problematic. I think that the other thing I'd say, and this is really in a way hinting into my other research interest, which is in environmental issues and environmental theology, I do think that the biblical perspective on being human, that we are part of creation, we worship God along with all creation, and we're warned against pride and we should adopt humility, has implications for the way that we live in the world, in our attitudes to non-human creation, so the rest of the world, the environment, animals and so on, as well as to people with mental incapacity or severely handicapped babies or the very elderly and so on. So thinking about our place in the world, again, that's a biblical theme that comes through quite strongly. So then, I said we'd come back to the image of God, and I want to tackle this a little bit, although when Dennis was talking about it, I thought, he's stolen my material. Actually, I'm going to adopt a more theological just overview, if you like, of this concept, just to show you how rich and diverse the traditions of interpretation have been, and, suggest one that I think holds more merit, and it is slightly different from Dennis's. So it has a range of meanings, this term. It's, as I said, a couple of times in the Bible, but not really explained. If I have on my bookshelf a commentary on the book of Genesis written by a German scholar that has about 6 pages of detailed explanation of all the different people that have talked about image of God. So it's a big book, 6 pages long, just of telling you who has written what about image of God and when. And it's impossible to unpack and to all we can say is that so many people have thought about it and come up with different ideas. But they do fall into 3 types, these ideas about the image of God. And the first one is what's called the structural view, that there is some capacity or cognitive function that humans share. So and this is particularly, I think, a view that was prevalent in the early church and through into the Middle Ages and beyond. There's something about us. So it might be soul, or it might be free will, or it might be rationality, something that is different, and it's quite often a cognitive capacity. Now, of course, this is a form of dualism. It does entail mind-body dualism, and it does devalue, it seems to me, the human body, the embodiment that we see in the Old Testament. And there are problems with the evolutionary perspective that humans are evolved from other species. I'm going to give you some examples of these different views from theologians in a minute. Let me just go on to the next one. The functional view. This is the view that humans, the image of God means that humans are, in some ways, have a function to fulfill. And often the functional is seen as being representative of God, or having some unique role to play in the created order. Now, Dennis gave a quote from one of the ancient Near Eastern Assyrian kings, where he talked about the king being the image of God. And the functional view is based on that kind of evidence. Another kind of idea that's in the ancient world and that is not quite the same as the king as the image is related is the idea that when a king conquered a new territory in the ancient world, he would often get a statue of himself and put it in that land as a marker that this was now his land. And that his image there showed that this land now belonged to him, or this town now belonged to him, this city. So the idea that image of God is functional and is denoting responsibility and authority. That's the functional view. And then the third one is the relational view, the idea that humans are unique by virtue of our capacity for relationship and special relationship to God. So that it's to do with our relational capacities that we are marked out as distinct. So, okay, let me just look at some early theologians. If we think about the structural view, you get things like this. This is Irenaeus talking about someone. Irenaeus had the view that in Genesis 1, it talks about God being made in the image and the likeness of God. And for Irenaeus, the image was one thing totally separate from the likeness. They were two distinct things. Now, that can't be substantiated from the Hebrew. Really, it's not, there's no grounds for that. But he thought that the image was the rational self, reason, the freedom of the will, the faculties that are intrinsic to all humanity. And these things weren't affected by the fall, by the coming of sin. Whereas the likeness was actually the Spirit of God indwelling humanity. So it was lost at the fall. That was what was lost at the fall. The image of God wasn't lost, but the likeness of God was lost. And that is then restored through Christ. So that's what this quote is saying. So two, kind of a dualistic view there, that image and likeness are separate. And then moving on to Augustine, he has very much the focus on intellect. Again, man's excellence consists in the fact that God made him in his own image by giving him an intellectual soul, which raises him above the beasts of the field. If we move on to Aquinas, Aquinas thinks that in all creatures there is something of the likeness of God, something of the image of God in all creatures. But in rational creatures, in other words, humans for Aquinas, we find a likeness of image in other creatures that is only a trace. So the intellect or mind, he says, is that whereby the rational creature excels other creatures. Wherefore, this image of God is not found even in the rational creature, except in the mind. I'm having to move on quite quickly through this. I've got a slide which talks about the functional view, and this is the view that I was talking about, that there is some function that humans are entitled to carry out. Just let me blow my nose. And this is from a scholar who is still alive in Sheffield, an elderly man now, called David Kleins, who reviewed the whole of the evidence, the ancient Near Eastern evidence, the theological evidence in the ancient world. He said, man is not created not in God's image, since God has no image of his own, but as God's image, or rather to be God's image. That is, to deputize in the created world for the transcendent God who remains outside the world order. So man is the visible, corporeal representative of the invisible, bodiless God. So that's the functional view, representation. Moving on into some 20th century theology, Karl Barth, as Dennis outlined this morning, had a relational view. And he looked at the difference, the man-woman difference in Genesis 1, and said the image is the difference and the relationship between man and fellow man. We should say between people and fellow people. And he wasn't prepared to discuss it anymore. He was kind of just leaving it there. The difference and the relationship between us as individuals, us as people. Robert Jensen, another, this is an American theologian who's still alive. He thought that humanity's special relationship to God itself was our uniqueness, our imaging of God. So he said, the image of God, if we are to use this phrase comprehensively for humanity's distinctiveness, is simply that we are related to God as his conversational counterpart. Because God speaks with us, we know he is personal. As we answer him, we too are personal. Now, that one, you might say, falls down on the same grounds that Warren Brown's list falls down, insofar as not every person, you might say, is capable of speaking to God. And you might say, well, does that mean that a baby that cannot articulate religious thoughts or prayer is not in the image of God? And I think we'd want to say no to that. Two things I say to that. One is that possibly Jensen's words need to be taken corporately, not as individuals, but corporately as people. And the second is that actually perhaps he's being too precise when he uses the language of speaking and answering. And the question then arises whether someone who is not able to be mentally cognizant actually can have relationship with God. So that's a profound metaphysical, philosophical question we can't really go into today. But my own view is that just as there is some intuitive sense, religious sense in human beings, that is then enables them to relate to their Creator. And then last quote is Catholic Theology. This is from the International Theological Commission in 2004. Implicit in the Catholic theology of the Imago Dei is the profound truth that the material world creates the conditions for the engagement of human persons with one another. And actually this is, in a way, what I like over Jensen's view that it's just relationship between God and people, because it's actually talking about us relating to one another. So the image of God in a newborn baby may well be that somebody loves it, somebody wants it there, somebody is responding to its needs, and in a way acting as God's representative towards them by caring for it. And the same is true perhaps of somebody at the end of life. Okay, my time is nearly up, and so I'm just going to come on to a little bit of a conclusion. And I'm going back for this to Joel Green, whose work I found very helpful. So let me just summarize. Human identity is formed and found in our self-conscious relationality, so the fact that we self-consciously can relate to one another, to the world, and in the stories by which we make sense of the world. So we all have narratives, with that word again. We all have narratives by which we make sense of our lives and other people's lives, and that's part of our identity and the image of God. Joel Green says this: who we are, our personhood, is inextricably bound up in our physicality, and so is inextricably tied up to the cosmos God has created, and in the sum of our life experiences and relationships. And that includes, as he says, relating to the whole of the world. Death is not, according to Green, just a biological event. It's the cessation of our bodies, but it is also the conclusion of an embodied life, the severance of relationships, the fading of our personal narrative, our personal story comes to an end, apart from how that is remembered by other people. But to that I would add John Polkinghorne's suggestion that all of that sense of who we are, our stories, our personhood, is held in the mind of God. And life after death, of course, requires re-embodiment, which provides the basis for relational and narrative continuation of our lives. And, of course, for the Christian, this is only possible through God in Christ in the final resurrection. So thank you very much.